In the early summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become a vast battlefield of uncertainty and dread. Just 6 months after the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy was still reeling. The Imperial Japanese Navy, with its advanced tactics, seasoned aviators, and unbroken string of victories across the Pacific, seemed unstoppable. Island after island had fallen. The Philippines were lost. Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies had been crushed. Under the weight of Japanese expansion, morale among American forces, though recovering, was still shaken, and many feared that Japan's next strike would bring the war to Hawaii or even the U.S. mainland. But what the Japanese did not know was that American codebreakers had been working tirelessly behind the scenes. In a cramped, overheated room in Pearl Harbor, a team of intelligence officers had broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code, giving the United States its first real advantage. Through patient decryption and bold interpretation, they discovered that the Japanese were planning an operation against a location they repeatedly referred to as AF. Commander Joseph Rushford and his team believed AF referred to Midway Island, a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific, home to an important American airstrip and naval base. To test the hypothesis, the Americans sent a deceptive radio transmission from Midway stating that their water distillation system had broken down. Hours later, Japanese intercepts confirmed that AF was low on water. The target had been confirmed. Now the Americans had a chance, not just to defend, but to strike back. A chance for vengeance. A chance to change the tide. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, moved quickly. Though the Japanese vastly outnumbered the Americans in ships and planes, Nimitz would use the element of surprise to level the playing field. He positioned his 3 available aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. On paper, it was a gamble. The Japanese fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto consisted of 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and a large escort force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Americans were outgunned, outmanned, and outexperienced, but what they had was knowledge. They knew when and where the Japanese would strike. In the early morning hours of June 4, 1942, the first wave of Japanese aircraft launched from the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their mission was to bomb the installations on Midway and soften it for a future amphibious assault. As the Japanese planes roared toward the atoll, American reconnaissance aircraft spotted the enemy fleet. The time had come. From Midway, U.S. Marine Corps fighters and bombers scrambled to intercept the incoming Japanese strike force. The defenders were courageous, but the odds were grim. Their aircraft were outdated, slow, and poorly armed compared to the elite Japanese Zero fighters. Many of them were shot down in fiery crashes before they could even fire a shot. But the Americans were determined to make the enemy bleed. Bombers like the Vought SB-2U Vindicator and the Douglas TBD Devastator were thrown into the skies in desperation. Most were destroyed. Pilots perished without scoring a single hit. It was a slaughter, but it wasn't in vain. As the Japanese focused on Midway, the American carriers moved into position. Now it was their turn to strike. Waves of American planes took off from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. But communication was poor, navigation difficult, and fuel a constant concern. The first groups to find the Japanese fleet were the torpedo squadrons. Flying obsolete devastators, they approached low and slow, aiming their torpedoes at the enemy carriers. But without fighter cover, they were sitting ducks. One by one, they were cut to pieces by the Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. Torpedo Squadron. 8 from USS Hornet was wiped out to the last man, with only one survivor, Ensign George Gay, who floated in the water and watched the rest of the battle unfold, and yet their sacrifice was pivotal. While the Japanese fighters were pulled down low to deal with the torpedo bombers, they left the skies above vulnerable. At that exact moment, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers arrived, dauntless SBDs from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown. From high altitude, they dove upon the Japanese carriers, which were in a vulnerable state, with flight decks cluttered with refueling and rearming aircraft. Explosions erupted across the horizon. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's front line, carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. Black smoke poured into the sky. The sea, once calm, boiled with destruction. It was a stunning reversal. Admiral Nagumo, commander of the Japanese carrier strike force, was caught completely off guard. Just hours earlier, he had stood on the deck of Akagi, confident of victory. Now, his fleet was crippled. Only one carrier, the Hiryu, remained operational, and she would not go down without a fight. From Hiryu, Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes launched a desperate counterstrike. Their target, USS Yorktown. In a series of coordinated attacks, the Japanese managed to hit Yorktown with bombs and torpedoes, severely damaging the ship and temporarily knocking it out of action. The crew fought valiantly to save her, and for a brief moment it seemed the damage was under control. But the second wave came, and Yorktown was struck again. Flames erupted. The proud carrier was dead in the water, and yet the sacrifice of Yorktown bought precious time. From Enterprise and Hornet, American aircraft located Hiryu and delivered a final blow. Bombs tore through the deck, igniting fires that raged out of control. The last of Japan's striking force was gone. By the next morning, Hiryu too had sunk beneath the waves. In the span of a single day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, ships that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months prior. More than 300 aircraft were destroyed. Scores of Japan's best aviators were lost, men who could not be easily replaced. In contrast, the United States had lost only 1 carrier, a few cruisers and destroyers, and several dozen aircraft. It was a stunning victory, a turning point. Midway was not just revenge, it was a statement. The Japanese Navy would never again go on the offensive in the Pacific. From this point forward, the tide of the war had shifted. The United States had shown that even when outnumbered and wounded, it could strike with devastating force. It had stood its ground, endured the early pain of war, and now was ready to fight back. The battle was far from over. But Midway lit the fire of hope across the Pacific. American soldiers, sailors, and airmen now believed in their strength. Their commanders had earned their respect, and the enemy had been shaken to its core. The morning after the decisive blow at Midway, the horizon was still veiled in smoke. The carcasses of the once mighty Japanese carriers slowly vanished beneath the Pacific, leaving oil slicks and floating debris as solemn reminders of their demise. American sailors aboard the USS Enterprise and Hornet stood silently on their decks, staring across the waves, exhausted yet vindicated. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States had dealt a blow of equal weight to the Empire of Japan. But even in victory, the scars ran deep. The ocean had claimed too many lives. The silence after the battle was not triumphal, it was heavy. News of the outcome reached Washington, D.C. slowly. At first, the official reports were vague, fleet movements were classified, and radio silence kept much of the victory under wraps. But behind closed doors, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Admiral Ernest King knew what had just occurred. The tide had turned. The American people would not hear all the details for some time, but within naval circles, the Battle of Midway was recognized as nothing less than a miracle. The Japanese juggernaut had been halted, not by superior numbers, but by courage, code-breaking, and the unshakable resolve of American aviators who had willingly flown into death to give others a chance to strike. For the Japanese, The loss was catastrophic. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, had gambled everything on Midway. He had believed the Americans would be demoralized, hesitant, and outmaneuvered. But he had underestimated their tenacity and, more importantly, their intelligence capabilities. The Japanese High Command did not publicly admit the extent of the defeat. For months, their citizens remained unaware that the mighty carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been lost. The illusion of invincibility remained, briefly. But within the ranks of the Imperial Navy, morale began to crack. The core of their veteran carrier air groups had been annihilated. Replacement pilots lacked experience. Replacement carriers could not be built quickly enough. And the Americans, they were just beginning. While the surface calm returned to the Pacific beneath the surface, a new war began, one of industry, logistics, and momentum. In the shipyards of California, New York, and Virginia, American workers poured into factories day and night. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and Liberty ships rolled out of assembly lines like clockwork. American industrial strength, long underestimated by Tokyo, now revealed its true scale. The Essex-class carriers, faster and more capable than their predecessors, began to enter service. Newer aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and the SB-2C Helldiver were being readied for combat, designed specifically to outperform the agile Japanese Zeros. At the same time, the Navy and Marine Corps shifted from defensive operations to offensive island hopping. The strategy, masterminded by Admiral Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, aimed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and capture key islands that could serve as airbases for further assaults. It would be a brutal campaign. Every island would be fought for with blood. But after Midway, there was no doubt America was on the offensive. The psychological shift was immense. In mess halls and barracks across the Pacific, talk of doom and retreat began to fade. Instead, men spoke of revenge, of Guadalcanal, of New Georgia, of the long road to Tokyo. The memory of Pearl Harbor still burned in their minds. But now, so did the memory of Midway. It was no longer just a war of survival. It had become a mission to dismantle the empire that had dared to strike them so deeply. American air crews began training more aggressively, studying the tactics used at Midway. Dive bombing, once viewed as outdated, became the foundation of carrier strike warfare. Pilots reviewed every inch of film taken during the battle. Mistakes were analyzed, maneuvers were refined. Survivors of the battle became instructors for the next wave of aviators. Men like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Dick Best, who had led the successful dive-bombing attacks, were hailed as heroes. Their actions became case studies in courage under pressure. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to recover. The shipyards at Kure and Yokosuka ramped up production, but the resource limitations were growing worse. Japan lacked the oil, rubber, and steel to keep up with the relentless pace of American production. The conquest of Southeast Asia had provided temporary relief, but American submarines were now patrolling Japanese supply lines with deadly efficiency. Merchant convoys were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Perhaps most damaging of all was the loss of trust within the Japanese command structure. Yamamoto, though still revered, had lost face. Internal disagreements began to flare. Some commanders wanted to adopt a defensive posture, preserving resources for a potential American invasion. Others insisted on continuing offensive operations, determined to bleed the Americans dry before they reached the Japanese homeland. But the unity that had carried Japan to early victories had been fractured at Midway. Doubt, once unthinkable, now whispered through the ranks. As the summer of 1942 turned into autumn, the next chapter of the war began on the island of Guadalcanal. There in the steaming jungles of the Solomon Islands, American Marines would begin a 6-month struggle to wrest control of the island from Japanese forces. It was a grinding, savage campaign. The conditions were hellish: malaria, snakes, endless rain, and swarms of enemy soldiers who fought with a fanatical willingness to die. But every inch gained on Guadalcanal was another step away from the shadows of Pearl Harbor and another step toward total Pacific dominance. Throughout the campaign, the lessons of Midway were constantly applied. Carrier aviation supported ground operations with greater coordination. Air superiority was no longer a luxury, it was essential, and the idea that the Japanese were unbeatable was finally shattered. Midway had proved that American aviators could match and defeat the best. Guadalcanal proved they could do it again and again. Back home, the American public was beginning to hear more details of the battle that had changed everything. Though much was still classified, the name Midway began to appear in newspapers and on the radio. War bond posters showed images of burning carriers and victorious pilots. The message was clear: the United States had struck back. And it would keep striking until the war was over. Even Hollywood joined the effort. Films and documentaries inspired by Midway began production, portraying the heroism of the Navy's aviators and sailors. Recruitment surged. Young men from farms in Iowa and cities in Pennsylvania lined up to enlist, hoping to serve on aircraft carriers, to become part of the legend. Midway had become more than a battle, it was a rallying cry. In the Pacific, the legacy of Midway lingered with every new campaign. The Japanese were no longer able to deploy carrier strike groups in the same numbers. Their best pilots were gone, and their new recruits were less trained and more hesitant. Every American victory from then on, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, stood on the shoulders of the Midway victory. The shockwave of that single day in June 1942 echoed through the entire war. But the price was never forgotten. At memorials in Hawaii and on ships at sea, sailors gathered to remember the torpedo squadrons who had died without scoring a single hit, the Marines who had launched from Midway in outdated aircraft, and the carrier crews who had gone down with their ships. Their sacrifice had opened the door for victory, and their memory would ensure that it never closed again. As the months passed after Midway, the Pacific became a battlefield of attrition. The Japanese Empire, still powerful, fought fiercely for every island, every strip of beach, every reef-laced atoll. But they were no longer on the offensive. Instead, they were being pushed back, slowly, brutally, and relentlessly. And behind every American advance was the growing shadow of Midway, the battle that had reversed the tide. Guadalcanal had become the proving ground of America's new resolve. The campaign stretched from August 1942 into February 1943, marked by savage jungle fighting, naval duels under cover of night, and the constant roar of aircraft engines above the treetops. Every gain was contested. American Marines dug in, fighting not just enemy bullets, but disease, exhaustion, and psychological strain. Japanese forces launched desperate counterattacks, often under cover of darkness, and refused to surrender even when defeat was inevitable. But slowly, the Americans adapted. They learned the rhythms of the Pacific War. Airstrips like Henderson Field became lifelines, giving U.S. planes the ability to strike deep into enemy-held territory. The Navy refined its tactics, integrating carrier strikes with land-based operations. Radar began to tilt night battles in favor of the Americans. The lessons from Midway, of timing, of coordination, of decisive strikes, were implemented with precision. As Guadalcanal finally fell into American hands in early 1943, a new confidence surged through Allied commands. The Japanese army, though, still a dangerous force, had lost thousands of irreplaceable soldiers in the effort. Worse still, Japan's ability to reinforce and resupply its distant garrisons was being steadily choked by American submarines and long-range bombers. The noose was tightening. Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, leading separate but complementary offensives across the Pacific, began to outline a strategy that would bring the war directly to Japan's doorstep. The island-hopping campaign would now accelerate, skipping heavily defended outposts and instead seizing weaker targets that could serve as forward bases for air power. Each conquest brought American bombers closer to the Japanese homeland. Meanwhile, U.S. carriers continued to gain strength. The Essex-class fleet carriers, now entering service in greater numbers, were more capable than any ship Japan had afloat. They carried more planes, had greater armor, and operated with experienced battle-hardened crews, pilots trained in stateside. Programs were now arriving by the thousands. These were not the hastily trained volunteers of 1941. They were part of a vast military machine that had learned from every success and every failure. The quality of American aircraft had also surged. Ahead, the F-6F Hellcat, introduced in mid-1943, was built to counter the Zero. It had superior firepower, armor, and survivability. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it turned the tables in the skies. By 1944, American pilots were racking up victory, ratios previously unthinkable, thanks to better equipment, radar guidance, and aggressive training that emphasized teamwork over lone heroism. One of the most symbolic moments of this shift came in November 1943, when the Americans launched a full-scale assault on Tarawa, part of the Gilbert Islands. Though the battle was short, lasting only 76 hours, it was among the bloodiest of the war. Japanese troops had fortified the small island with bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery. When the Marines landed, they were met with devastating fire. Hundreds died in the surf, cut down before reaching dry land, but the Americans did not retreat. Inch by inch, they fought their way across the island, clearing bunkers with flamethrowers and grenades. In the end, nearly every Japanese defender was killed. It was a brutal introduction to what lay ahead, a war of close-quarters slaughter, fought not in vast naval battles, but on beaches and coral reefs, where there was nowhere to run. Still, each victory brought the United States closer to Japan. The Marshalls fell next, then the Marianas. At Saipan, the American forces not only seized an island, they seized the ability to strike Tokyo directly. B-29, superfortress bombers with unprecedented range and payload, could now reach the heart of Japan from newly constructed airfields. The Japanese Navy, once the dominant force of the Pacific, could no longer challenge the American fleet on equal terms. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw U.S. pilots shoot down more than 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The scale of the loss was staggering. Japan had trained for years to build its elite aviators. Now, most of them were gone, replaced by poorly trained recruits who barely survived their first missions. For American forces, the war was becoming less about surviving and more about advancing. Logistics chains stretched from the west coast of the United States all the way to the Philippine Sea, supplying fuel, ammunition, food, and medical care to millions of servicemen. The industrial might of America, so often dismissed by Japanese strategists in the early days, was now the defining factor of the war, yet for every advance, the price was high. At Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, the Americans learned that Japan would never surrender easily. Civilian casualties mounted. Kamikaze attacks began to terrorize U.S. fleets as Japanese pilots turned themselves into human bombs in a desperate effort to inflict damage. And still, the Americans pushed forward. Behind every beachhead, every airfield, every carrier deck was the memory of Midway. It had proven what was possible. It had transformed a nation gripped by loss into a force of vengeance and resolution. It was not just a naval victory, it had been a turning of the national spirit. Every American ship that sailed into battle, every plane that soared into the blue Pacific sky, carried that history with it. In Tokyo, the situation had grown desperate. The military junta clung to illusions of a negotiated peace. But the writing was on the wall. Cities were burning, resources were gone, allies had vanished, and across the ocean, the Americans came, stronger than ever, with a righteous fury that had been born on the morning of December 7th and reborn in the fires of June 4th. The Japanese people, increasingly disillusioned with the war, began to suffer under the weight of endless bombing raids and chronic shortages. Black markets thrived, rice was scarce, families split apart. The emperor, once a divine figure in the minds of many, became a symbol of silence as the war dragged on with no end in sight. Yet the United States showed no signs of slowing. They had come too far, sacrificed too much. Vengeance was no longer enough. Now, total victory was the goal. The war would not end until Japan surrendered unconditionally. As the noose tightened further and the final campaigns loomed, Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo, and eventually the nuclear strikes. The legacy of Midway remained etched in every order, every mission, every funeral. It was where hope had been reborn, where strategy had triumphed over arrogance, and where the first spark of American vengeance lit a fire that would burn all the way to Japan's doorstep. By early 1945, the Pacific had become a corridor of fire. Each island conquered brought the United States closer to Japan, but each came at a staggering cost. The victories had become more brutal, more desperate, and more revealing of what lay ahead should the Allies attempt a full-scale invasion of the Japanese homeland. It was no longer a war of carriers and code-breaking. It had transformed into a grinding, hand-to-hand struggle where terrain was measured in yards and death waited behind every tree, every cave, every cliff. The island of Iwo Jima rose from the ocean like a black scar. Volcanic, sulphurous, and barren, it held little strategic value on the surface, but its location, almost halfway between the Marianas and the Japanese mainland, made it essential for American bomber operations. If captured, it could serve as an emergency landing base for damaged B-29 superfortresses returning from raids over Tokyo. To the Japanese, it was a critical barrier to homeland defense. To the Americans, it was a blood price that had to be paid. The invasion of Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945. The beaches were choked with ash, the air thick with smoke. The Japanese had prepared for months, carving tunnels deep into Mount Suribachi and the island's rocky interior. They did not defend the beaches directly, but instead waited underground. When the Marines pushed inland, the mountain erupted with fire. The slaughter began. For 5 weeks, the Americans battled for every inch of ground. Grenades, flamethrowers, satchel charges. Nothing was spared. The Japanese refused to surrender. Many fought to the death in suicidal charges or detonated grenades. Beneath their chests, American casualties mounted. Thousands died. Tens of thousands were wounded. But on the 5th day, a group of Marines reached the summit of Suribachi and planted the American flag. The photograph of that moment, men hoisting the stars and stripes atop the mountain, would become one of the most iconic images of the entire war. But the fighting continued for nearly a month longer. In the end, the U.S. captured the island. Nearly all of the Japanese defenders perished, and soon American bombers were landing safely on its runways. But the cost had been staggering. Over 26,000 American casualties. The price of getting close to Japan was becoming almost too high to bear. Yet the Americans pressed forward, Okinawa was next. Okinawa was different. It was not a remote atoll or volcanic rock. It was a large island with a civilian population and a complex infrastructure. It was the final stepping stone before the Japanese home islands. If taken, Okinawa would serve as the launch pad for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan itself. Both sides knew what was at stake. The invasion of Okinawa began on April 1st, 1945. At first, the landings were eerily quiet. American forces came ashore with minimal resistance, but it was a trap. The Japanese had adopted a new defensive strategy: fight from the interior, make every hill a fortress, every ridge a redoubt. The Americans advanced into a nightmare. The Japanese defense was methodical and suicidal. They used caves, cliffs, and concrete bunkers. Kamikaze planes launched from the mainland struck the U.S. fleet in waves, damaging dozens of ships and killing thousands of sailors. On land, the Japanese held every ridge with fanatical determination. The Americans responded with overwhelming firepower: naval bombardments, airstrikes, tanks, and infantry assaults. It was a battle of annihilation. Civilians were caught in the middle. Propaganda had convinced many Okinawans that the Americans would commit atrocities. Thousands took their own lives, jumping from cliffs, hiding in caves, dying with their children in their arms. The trauma of Okinawa scarred survivors for generations. When the island finally fell in June, the United States was left with a chilling realization. If Japan fought this savagely for Okinawa, what would they do on the home islands? Okinawa had cost the U.S. over 49,000 casualties. Japanese losses were estimated at over 100,000, including civilians. There seemed no end in sight, yet American forces were now fully positioned for a final blow. The B-29 bombers based in the Marianas and Iwo Jima began their raids over Japan in full force. Night after night, cities burned. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9-10, 1945 had already killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night. Wooden homes ignited like matchsticks. The wind turned flames into cyclones. Families suffocated in underground shelters or melted in the streets. It was the single deadliest air raid of the war. But still, Japan refused to surrender. Back in Washington, American leaders debated the next step. An invasion of Japan would require an unprecedented mobilization, millions of soldiers, endless supplies, and likely hundreds of thousands of additional casualties. The Japanese military was preparing civilians, including children, to defend the home islands with bamboo spears. Entire towns were being trained for suicide attacks. It would be a war of extinction. Then, in the deserts of New Mexico, a new weapon was tested. The Trinity test, conducted on July 16, 1945, changed the trajectory of the war forever. The atomic bomb had become a reality. The United States now had the power to end the war with a single strike, but at an unimaginable moral cost. President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April, faced an agonizing decision: drop the bomb and force surrender, or risk a catastrophic invasion. The choice would haunt the world forever. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island. Its mission, Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was dropped at 8:15 a.m. The city was obliterated in seconds. Tens of thousands died instantly. Fires consumed everything. Hospitals collapsed. Radiation poisoned the survivors. 3 days later, another bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction was equally horrific. Finally, the Japanese government, faced with total annihilation, surrendered. The war was over. But for the men who had fought at Midway, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the end came with a quiet, haunted relief. The vengeance they had sworn after Pearl Harbor had been fulfilled. The enemy was defeated. The Pacific, once a battlefield of despair, was now under American control, and yet the cost defied calculation. In the aftermath of Nagasaki, the world seemed to pause. Across the Pacific, the guns fell silent. Radio transmissions that once carried coordinates for bomb runs or cries for reinforcements now carried only a single, sobering word: surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people directly for the first time in history. His voice, calm and dignified, announced Japan's decision to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. He did not say the word defeat. He did not mention the atomic bombs, but the message was clear. The war was over. For the American soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had survived the island-hopping campaigns, the news came with a surge of disbelief. On aircraft carriers scattered across the Pacific, crews stood still in stunned silence, then erupted into spontaneous cheers. On distant islands like Guam and Saipan, where the soil was still soaked with blood, men wept, laughed, and fell to their knees. At Pearl Harbor, veterans of the first strike stood together and remembered their fallen. They had promised to avenge them, and they had. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender ceremony took place. Japanese representatives, in their finest suits and with expressions of solemn dignity, signed the instrument of surrender. Across from them stood the victorious Allied officers, General Douglas MacArthur, Admiral Chester Nimitz, and representatives from Britain, China, the Soviet Union, Australia, and others. The weight of the moment was immense. Cameras captured every gesture, flags stirred in the breeze. The ink dried on a document that marked the end of a global catastrophe. For Admiral Nimitz, who had gambled everything at Midway 3 years earlier, the moment was more than symbolic. It was personal. He had taken a fleet still licking its wounds after Pearl Harbor and turned it into the most powerful naval force in history. He had believed in the codebreakers, in the dive bombers, in the men who flew into near-certain death. At Midway, just to give the next wave a shot at victory, their courage had not been forgotten, and Midway was remembered. In war rooms and classrooms, its strategies were studied and praised. Historians began to call it the most important naval battle of the 20th century, not just because of the ships sunk or the aircraft lost, but because of what it symbolized: a reversal, a rising, a rebirth. It was the moment when the United States stopped running and began the long, vengeful march across the Pacific. In the decades that followed, veterans of Midway would often speak of the battle with reverence. Some remembered the confusion of launch, orders, the endless searches for the Japanese fleet, the long silences over the radio. Others remembered the flames, the black plumes rising from Akagi and Kaga, the sickening moments when torpedo squadrons were cut to pieces before their eyes. Most of all, they remembered the feeling when those dive bombers struck their targets. The explosion, the realization, the moment the war shifted, the legacy of Midway rippled through generations. It became the foundation of modern naval doctrine. It proved the dominance of carrier warfare over battleships, shifted investment toward aviation, and underscored the value of intelligence and timing over sheer numbers. The sacrifice of the Devastator pilots who died without landing a hit was immortalized in monuments. The flag raisers on Iwo Jima became national icons. The Hellcat and Dauntless pilots who paved the skies for final victory were honored in museums and textbooks. But the legacy was not only one of military success, it was also one of caution. The war in the Pacific had revealed the cost of underestimating an enemy, of overconfidence, of racial arrogance and ideological extremism. It had shown the brutality that human beings could unleash upon one another, even on the waves of the world's largest ocean. And in Japan, the defeat brought not just destruction, but transformation. The emperor renounced his divine status. The military was dismantled. A new constitution, overseen by American occupation forces, introduced democracy and pacifism. Cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols not just of war, but of peace, rebuilt from ashes with a vow to never again tread that path. The same nation that had once unleashed kamikazes now became a beacon of post-war recovery. Yet for all the progress, the shadows of Midway and the Pacific War lingered in the minds of survivors, in the photos of burning carriers, in the stillness of the ocean above sunken wrecks where thousands of men remained entombed. In 1946, a group of American divers descended into the waters near Midway Atoll. There, deep below the surface, lay fragments of aircraft, twisted steel, and ghostly reminders of battle. One diver found the remains of a dauntless dive bomber. The cockpit was intact. Inside was the helmet of a young pilot, still strapped in. He had never been recovered. His name was not immediately known, but the divers brought back the helmet, cleaned it and placed it in a naval museum. It now sits under glass, labeled simply, "He flew at Midway." That single artifact says what thousands of words cannot. That this war, this vengeance, this final victory, it was paid for not by grand speeches or glowing maps, but by ordinary men who climbed into fragile machines and flew into hell. Today, when Americans remember the Pacific War, they remember Pearl Harbor for its shock, Iwo Jima for its sacrifice, Hiroshima for its horror, but they remember Midway for its moment, for the morning when outnumbered aviators struck the heart of the enemy, for the day when fear became fury, when retreat became advance, when a nation broken by surprise stood up and roared back. Midway was the turning of the tide, and the tide never turned again.